If you run now, you might live long enough to regret it. The gun wasn't what froze me. It was the voice behind it. Low, calm, certain, like the outcome had already been decided and I was just catching up. My breath hitched somewhere between my chest and my throat as cold metal pressed lightly against my temple. Not hard, not urgent, just inevitable. The alley smelled like rain and gasoline. The kind of place you cut through when you're late and not thinking straight. That was my mistake. I was always late. Always trying to outrun something. Tonight, it finally caught up. Please, I whispered, not even sure who I was talking to. The man in front of me tightened his grip on my wrist, his fingers digging just enough to remind me I wasn't in control. My heart hammered so loud I couldn't hear the traffic anymore. Couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own fear. And then, footsteps. Slow. Measured. Not rushed. Not worried. The man holding me stiffened. Just for a second. Just enough for me to notice. Let her go. The voice came again, closer now. Closer than it should have been. Something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the entire night had just taken a step back to make room for him. I didn't turn. I couldn't. But I felt it. The weight of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be obeyed. The man in front of me swallowed. I felt it in the way his grip faltered, just slightly. This doesn't concern you, he said, but the confidence was gone. Replaced with something thinner. Something fragile. A quiet breath behind me. Then, almost gently, it does now. Silence. Thick. Pressing. And then the pressure against my head disappeared. Not violently. Not suddenly. Just gone. My knees nearly gave out. But the same hand that had held me moments ago let go completely, stepping back like I was something he no longer wanted to touch. I turned then. Slowly. And that was my second mistake. Because the man standing behind me wasn't just dangerous. He was composed. Impossibly so. Dark coat, perfectly tailored. Eyes that didn't rush, didn't flicker, didn't question. They simply assessed. Calculated. Decided. He looked at me like he already knew the ending. Like I was just a detail in a story he'd written years ago. You shouldn't be here, he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. Just fact. Just truth. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Because something inside me understood, deep and immediate, this wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was something else. Something bigger. His gaze shifted past me for half a second, and that was all it took. The other man backed away. No argument. No protest. Just gone. Like he'd never been there. Like he'd never had a choice. And then it was just us. Rain starting again. Soft at first. Then heavier. I realized I was shaking. Who are you? I managed. He studied me for a moment. Not my face. Not my clothes. Me. Like he was measuring something invisible. Then, finally, he said, the reason you're still alive. My stomach dropped. Not from fear. Not entirely. But from the way he said it. Like it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. And somehow that was worse. Because in that moment, standing under flickering streetlight with rain soaking through my jacket and my pulse refusing to slow, I realized something I couldn't explain yet. I hadn't been saved. I had been chosen. I did not remember walking away from that alley, but suddenly I was inside a car that did not belong to my life. The kind of car that smelled like leather and quiet control, the kind that did not rattle when it idled, the kind you only saw parked outside buildings you were never invited into. And I sat there with my hands clenched in my lap, still shaking, still trying to understand how everything had shifted in less than 60 seconds. Because one moment I had been nobody, just a girl cutting through the wrong street at the wrong time. And the next I was sitting beside a man who spoke like outcomes obeyed him. And that thought alone made it hard to breathe. He did not look at me at first. His attention was on the road ahead, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other still, controlled, like even his silence had structure. And I realized then that he had not asked if I wanted to get in. He had simply opened the door and waited. And somehow that had been enough. You are safe now, he said after a moment. The words simple, but the way he said them made them feel less like comfort and more like a decision that had already been enforced. I swallowed, my voice still unsteady. Why? It came out quieter than I meant, almost swallowed by the hum of the engine. But he heard it. Of course he did. He seemed like the kind of man who did not miss anything. His gaze shifted briefly toward me. Not long. Just enough for me to feel it. Because you were not supposed to be there, he replied, and that should have made sense, but it did not. Because nothing about tonight made sense anymore. I turned slightly toward him, my fingers tightening together. That is not an answer, I said. And even I could hear the fragile edge in my voice. The part of me still trying to hold on to normal logic, normal rules. He exhaled slowly, not irritated, not impatient, just measured. It is the only one you need right now. And that was when I understood something else, something colder. He was not explaining himself because he did not have to. Outside the window, the city blurred past. Familiar streets turning unfamiliar under the weight of everything I had just seen, everything I had just felt, and I realized I did not know where we were going. I did not know anything except that I had stepped into something I could not step out of. Stop the car, I said suddenly, the words rushing out before I could stop them. I can take care of myself. It was automatic, instinct, the last piece of independence I could still reach for. His hand did not move. His speed did not change, but something in the air shifted again, subtle, like a line I had just crossed. No, he said, not harsh, not loud, just final. My chest tightened. You do not get to decide that. I turned fully toward him now, fear mixing with something sharper, something that refused to disappear completely. You do not get to decide that either. I shot back, and for the first time, something almost like interest flickered in his expression, brief, controlled. But there, you think this is about control, he said quietly. It is not. I let out a breath that trembled despite me trying to hold it steady. Then what is it about? The question hung between us, heavier than it should have been, and for a second, I thought he might not answer at all. But then he slowed the car as we approached a red light, the glow reflecting faintly in his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. It is about timing. I frowned, confusion cutting through the fear. Timing of what? The light turned green. The car moved again, and he did not look at me this time when he answered. Of you finally crossing into my world. My stomach dropped, not because I understood, but because I did not, and somehow that made it worse. I leaned back slightly, the leather cold against my skin, my mind racing through every possible explanation that still felt too small, too ordinary for what this felt like. I did not choose that. I whispered, more to myself than to him, and this time he did look at me, fully, directly, and there was no hesitation in his voice when he replied. No, he said. I did. The car did not take me home, and I knew it long before the skyline changed, long before the streets grew quieter and the buildings taller, because nothing about this felt like a detour. It felt like a direction, like something that had already been mapped out long before I ever stepped into that alley. I watched the city slip away through the window, the familiar turning distant, replaced by polished glass and guarded entrances, places where people did not walk in without permission, and that thought settled heavily in my chest. Where are you taking me? I asked, my voice steadier now, not because I felt safe, but because fear was starting to harden into something else, something sharper, something that needed answers. He did not hesitate. Somewhere you can stay alive, he said, and again, it sounded less like reassurance and more like a fact that had already been decided. I shook my head slightly, trying to ground myself in logic. You still have not told me why I need that, I said, and this time, he did not respond right away. The silence, stretching just long enough to make me aware of every second passing, every breath I took in this car that did not belong to my world. Then finally, because someone was already looking for you tonight, he said, and that made my stomach drop in a way nothing else had, because I knew he was not guessing. He was stating something he already knew. I turned toward him fully, my pulse picking up again. That man in the alley? I asked, and he gave a small shake of his head. He was not the beginning, he replied, and the way he said it made everything feel bigger, more complicated than I had allowed myself to believe. I let out a quiet breath, trying to piece together something that made sense. I do not have anything worth that kind of attention, I said, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not disagreement, not exactly, but something close to it. That is where you are wrong, he said, and before I could ask what that meant, the car slowed, turning smoothly through a set of gates that opened without hesitation, as if they had been expecting us. My eyes lifted automatically, taking in the long driveway, the clean lines of a house that was not just large, but controlled, precise, every light placed exactly where it needed to be, every shadow intentional. It did not feel like a home. It felt like a place where decisions were made and followed without question. The car came to a stop, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I stared ahead, my reflection faint in the glass, trying to recognize the girl sitting there, the one who had left her apartment less than an hour ago thinking about rent and groceries, and whether she could afford both this week. That life felt small now, distant, like something I had already lost without realizing it. The engine went quiet, and then his voice again, calm, certain. "You will stay here tonight," he said, not asking, not suggesting, just placing the next piece on the board. I turned to him slowly, the weight of everything pressing in. "And tomorrow?" I asked, because somehow that mattered more. Somehow that was the question I was not ready to hear answered. His eyes met mine, steady, unshaken. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will understand why leaving is no longer an option." And something in the way he said it made my chest tighten, not just with fear, but with the quiet realization that whatever this was, whatever had started tonight, it was not temporary, it was not accidental, and deep down, somewhere I could not quite reach yet, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had not been taken here by chance. I had been brought here on purpose. I did not move right away, even after the engine went silent, even after the gates closed behind us with a quiet finality that felt louder than anything I had heard all night. Because stepping out of that car meant admitting this was real, that everything before this moment had not been some strange detour I could still undo. And I was not ready for that. Not yet. "We are here," he said, and the way he said it carried no urgency, no impatience, just certainty, like whether I moved or not did not change the outcome. I exhaled slowly, forcing my hands to unclench as I reached for the door, the handle cool under my fingers, and for a second, I hesitated, because once I stepped out, there was no pretending this was temporary, no telling myself I would just walk away. But then I opened it anyway, the night air hitting me colder than before, sharper, like it had changed along with everything else. The driveway stretched out beneath soft lights, the house rising ahead of me like something built to watch rather than welcome. Tall windows reflecting nothing back, clean lines, no wasted space. Everything about it controlled, intentional. I stepped out slowly, my shoes barely making a sound against the pavement, and I became aware of movement near the entrance. Two men standing near the doors, still, composed, watching without staring, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. I stopped a few feet from the car, my eyes moving from them back to him as he stepped out on the other side. Closing the door with quiet precision, he adjusted his coat slightly, a small movement, but it carried the same deliberate control as everything else about him. And suddenly I felt out of place in a way I had never felt before, not because I did not belong, but because I had never even been close to a place like this. "This is not necessary," I said, the words coming out steadier than I expected, because part of me still needed to try, still needed to draw some kind of line. "I can go back to my apartment." He looked at me then, fully, his expression unchanged, unreadable. "No," he said, simple, final. I let out a small breath, frustration slipping through now. "You do not even know me." I pushed, because that had to matter, that had to mean something. His gaze did not shift, did not soften. "I know enough," he replied, and that answer settled heavier than anything else, because it meant this was not random. It meant this was not coincidence. I folded my arms slightly, more for grounding than defiance. "Then tell me," I said. "Tell me what you think you know." For a moment, he was silent, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look away, like he was measuring something I could not see. And then he stepped closer, not invading, not rushing, just enough to close the distance between us. "I know you. We're not supposed to be in that alley," he said quietly. "I know someone else expected to find you there." My chest tightened, my mind trying to catch up with what he was saying. "And I know," he continued, his voice lowering slightly, "that if I had not arrived when I did, this conversation would not be happening." I swallowed, the weight of that settling in, not as a threat, but as a reality I could not argue against. The two men by the door opened it without being asked, stepping aside with silent precision, and he gestured toward the entrance, not forceful, not demanding, just inevitable. "Inside," he said, and for a second, I stayed where I was, the last piece of hesitation holding on, But then I stepped forward, because something inside me understood that standing still would not change anything. The air inside was warmer, controlled, the kind of temperature that never shifted unless someone decided it should. The space was quiet, not empty, just still, like even sound had rules here. I paused just past the threshold, turning slightly back toward him. This is not my world, I said, more to remind myself than anything else. And for the first time, something almost unreadable flickered in his expression, something deeper than control. I know, he said, his voice softer now, but no less certain. That is why you are still alive. I did not know where to stand, so I stayed near the doorway, like if I moved too far in, the house would close around me, and I would not find my way back out. The floors were polished to the point where every step felt deliberate, every sound controlled, and I became painfully aware of how loud my own breathing seemed in comparison. He walked past me without hesitation, as if this space adjusted to him rather than the other way around, and I turned slowly, watching him move through the room. Like he had never questioned his place in it, like everything here existed because he allowed it to. You can sit, he said, gesturing toward a long couch across the room. The fabric smooth, untouched, like it was meant to be seen more than used. I did not move right away, my arms still folded slightly, grounding myself in the only way I could. I am not staying, I said, the words firm, even though something inside me already knew how weak that sounded here. He paused for a fraction of a second, then continued walking, pouring a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on a nearby table, the small details catching my attention in a way they should not have, because this was not my life. This was not something I understood. He handed me the glass when he returned, and for a moment, I hesitated before taking it, the coolness of it steadying against my palm. You are staying tonight, he said, not raising his voice, not forcing the words, just placing them there like facts. I took a small sip, more to give myself something to do than because I needed it. You keep saying that like I do not have a choice, I replied, and this time, I held his gaze, refusing to look away. Something shifted then, subtle but real, like he recognized the challenge, not as defiance, but as something worth noting. You have choices, he said calmly. They are just not the ones you think. I let out a quiet breath, frustration building again. That is not how choices work, I said, and for the first time, the faintest trace of something almost like amusement touched his expression, brief and controlled. But there, in your world, he corrected, and that single sentence landed heavier than anything else, because it confirmed what I had been trying not to accept. This was not my world anymore, not in the way it had been before. I set the glass down carefully, my fingers lingering on the edge for a second before pulling back. Then explain it to me, I said, softer now, not because I was giving in, but because I needed to understand. Something, anything, that could make sense of this. He studied me again, that same assessing look that made it feel like he was reading something I could not hide. Someone placed you in a position tonight, he said slowly. A position you were never meant to walk away from. My chest tightened, the words settling deeper than I wanted them to. And you think bringing me here fixes that? I asked, and he shook his head slightly. No, he replied. It delays it. The honesty in that answer caught me off guard, not because it comforted me, but because it did not try to. It simply existed, unsoftened. I looked away for a second, my mind racing through possibilities I did not want to consider. So what happens when it does not delay anymore? I asked quietly, and when I looked back at him, his expression had not changed, not even slightly. Then, he said, his voice steady, unshaken, you will already belong somewhere they cannot reach. The word belong echoed in my mind, sharp, unfamiliar, and I felt something shift inside me, not acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the idea that I could simply walk away from this. I wrapped my arms around myself slightly, the room suddenly feeling larger than before. And where exactly is that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and this time, he did not hesitate at all. Here, he said, and the way he said it made the entire house feel less like a place and more like a decision that had already been made for me. The word here did not sound like a place anymore. It sounded like a boundary, and I felt it settle around me in a way I could not explain, not tight, not suffocating, but present, like invisible lines I had not seen. Until now, I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to stay grounded. You keep saying that like it means something different to you than it does to me, I said quietly, and this time, my voice did not shake, not because I was not afraid, but because I was starting to understand that fear did not change anything here. He watched me for a moment, his gaze steady, unreadable. It does, he replied, simple, direct, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant I was the one who did not understand the rules. I glanced around the room again, taking in the details I had missed before, the absence of clutter, the precision of everything, no personal items left out, no signs of hesitation. It felt less like someone lived here and more like someone operated here. People do not just end up in places like this by accident, I said, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. No, he said, they do not. I swallowed, my mind catching on that confirmation. Then why me? I asked, and this time, I did not look away. I needed to see his reaction, needed to understand if there was even a chance that this had been random. But there was no hesitation in him, no uncertainty, just that same quiet certainty that had followed him since the alley. Because you were in the wrong place at the right time, he said, and the answer felt incomplete, like something important had been left out on purpose. I frowned slightly. That does not make sense, I said, and for a second, his gaze softened, not with emotion, but with something closer to acknowledgement. It will, he replied, just not tonight. I exhaled, frustration flickering again, but it faded quickly, replaced by something heavier, something quieter, because I was starting to understand that pushing him would not give me answers faster. It would only remind me how little control I had here. I shifted slightly where I stood, my body finally registering the exhaustion creeping in, the long day, the sudden shift, the weight of everything pressing down at once. What happens now? I asked, and this time, the question felt different, less like resistance and more like preparation. He noticed, of course he did. He seemed to notice everything. Now, he said, you rest. I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. That is it? I asked, because it felt too simple, too small compared to everything else. He nodded once. That is it, he repeated, and then, after a brief pause, everything else can wait until morning. I hesitated, part of me still expecting something more, some hidden condition, some unspoken rule, but nothing came. Just that same calm certainty, and for the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected slip through the tension, not safety, not trust, but a pause, a moment where the chaos stopped moving long enough for me to breathe. I wrapped my arms around myself again, more from habit than necessity. And you? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quietly. His expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in the air, like I had asked something he had not expected. I do not rest, he said, and the simplicity of it made me blink, because it did not sound like a complaint. It sounded like a fact, like something that had always been true. I studied him for a second longer, trying to understand what kind of life created a man who spoke like that, who existed like that. But there was too much I did not know, too many pieces missing, and I finally looked away, letting out a slow breath as I accepted the only thing I could for now. This was not something I could solve tonight. A quiet sound came from somewhere deeper in the house, a door opening, footsteps approaching, and I realized without being told that someone else was coming, not as a surprise, but as part of the structure of this place, part of the system I had just stepped into. I straightened slightly. Instinctively, my senses sharpening again, and when I looked back at him, he was already watching me, not surprised, not concerned, just aware, always aware. You are safe here, he said again, and this time, the words did not feel like reassurance or control. They felt like something else entirely, something I could not name yet, something that made me wonder, just for a second, if safety in his world came with a cost I had not yet begun to understand. The footsteps grew clearer, measured, and unhurried, and I realized something before the person even appeared. No one in this house moved without purpose, not even the quietest step. A woman entered from the hallway, her posture straight, her expression composed, not cold, but controlled in a way that matched everything else here. She paused a few feet away, her eyes briefly meeting mine, not curious, not judgmental, just aware. like she had already been told everything she needed to know about me before I walked through the door. "Sir," she said softly, her voice calm and precise, and I felt it again. That shift in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement of his presence, of his authority. He gave a small nod. "Nothing exaggerated, nothing wasted. Prepare a room," he said, and the simplicity of the instruction made it clear this was not a request. The woman nodded once, then turned her attention to me. "This way," she said, her tone polite, but firm enough that I understood it was not optional. I hesitated for a second, my eyes flickering back to him. Not because I expected him to stop me, but because part of me still needed to check, to confirm that this was really happening. He did not move, did not speak, but his gaze held mine just long enough to say everything that needed to be said. This was part of it. I turned back to the woman and followed her, my steps quiet against the polished floor as we moved deeper into the house. The hallway stretched longer than I expected, lined with doors that remained closed, each one identical, each one revealing nothing. "Do you live here?" I asked without thinking, the question slipping out as we walked. She did not slow, did not hesitate. "I work here," she replied simply, and something about the wording caught my attention. Not live, work, like this place operated on a different set of rules even for the people inside it. We reached a door at the end of the hall, and she opened it with a smooth motion, stepping aside to let me enter first. The room was large, but not overwhelming. Everything arranged with the same precision I had noticed downstairs: a bed, a chair, a small table. Nothing unnecessary, nothing out of place. It felt prepared, not decorated, like it had been waiting without knowing who for. I stepped inside slowly, my gaze moving across the space, taking it in piece by piece, grounding myself in something tangible. "You will find everything you need here," she said from the doorway, and I turned slightly toward her. "Everything?" I repeated, and for the first time, there was the faintest pause in her composure, almost unnoticeable, but enough. "For tonight," she clarified, and that distinction settled quietly in my mind. "For tonight. Not forever, not even tomorrow, just tonight." I nodded slowly, not because I fully accepted it, but because I did not have the energy to argue anymore. She gave a small, respectful nod in return before stepping back, the door closing softly behind her. And just like that, I was alone. The silence in the room felt different from before, not heavy, not pressing, just still, like the space itself was waiting to see what I would do. I moved toward the bed, sitting on the edge carefully, my hands resting on my knees as I stared ahead, trying to process everything that had happened. The alley, the car, the house, him. It all felt too fast, too precise to be random. I leaned forward slightly, pressing my palms together, focusing on the steady rhythm of my breathing, in and out, slow, controlled, something I could still manage. But even as I tried to ground myself, one thought kept rising above everything else, louder than the fear, louder than the confusion, because it was the only piece that did not fit. He had said someone was looking for me before tonight, not because of what I had done, but because of something else, something I did not understand yet. And as I sat there in a room that did not belong to me, in a house that operated on rules I did not know, I realized something that made it impossible to fully relax. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning, and whatever had started, it had started long before I ever stepped into that alley. I did not lie down right away, even though my body felt like it had been carrying more than just exhaustion, because closing my eyes here felt like giving something up, like admitting I trusted a situation I did not understand, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. I stood instead, moving slowly around the room, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, the smooth surface of the wall, grounding myself in details that could not change no matter how strange everything else felt. The window drew my attention next, tall, wide, the glass reflecting my own image back at me more than the outside, and for a second, I barely recognized the girl staring back, her shoulders tense, her expression caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. I stepped closer, peering past my reflection. The grounds outside stretched farther than I expected, lights placed at careful intervals, illuminating paths that seemed more like boundaries than walkways. There was no movement, no sign of the city beyond, just quiet control. I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, the silence pressing in again, and that was when I noticed something I had missed before, my bag, placed neatly on the chair near the bed. I froze, my gaze locking onto it, because I had not carried it inside. I had not even thought about it since the alley, yet here it was, untouched, exactly as I had left it earlier that day. Something about that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant someone had gone back, had retrieved it, had thought about things I had not even had time to process. I walked toward it slowly, my steps measured, like moving too fast would somehow make it disappear. My fingers hovered over the strap before finally closing around it, the familiar weight anchoring me in a way nothing else had tonight. I opened it quickly, checking inside without thinking. Everything was there, my wallet, my phone, my keys, nothing missing, nothing disturbed, and yet it felt different now, like these things belonged to a version of me that had already been left behind. I pulled out my phone, the screen lighting up in the dim room, notifications stacked from earlier, missed calls, messages I had not seen, reminders of a life that suddenly felt distant. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, part of me wanting to call someone, anyone, to explain, to hear a voice that existed outside of this place. But another part of me stopped me, quieter, more cautious, because what would I even say? That I had been taken somewhere I could not leave by a man who spoke like everything was already decided, that I was safe but not free, that I did not even understand why I was here. I let out a slow breath, lowering the phone. The weight of that realization settling in. I could not explain this because I did not understand it. Myself, I set the phone back into my bag, closing it carefully, like sealing something away for later, and turned back toward the bed, sitting down slowly this time, the mattress giving slightly under my weight. Unfamiliar but steady, I leaned back just enough to rest my hands behind me, staring up at the ceiling, letting the quiet fill the space again. But this time, it felt different, less like pressure and more like waiting, like something had paused just long enough for me to catch up. My eyes drifted closed for a moment before opening again, because sleep still felt too far away, too vulnerable, and my mind kept circling back to the same thing. The way he had looked at me, not surprised, not curious, but certain, like I had always been part of something I had never seen before. I shifted slightly, pulling my legs up onto the bed, wrapping my arms around them, and finally let the exhaustion settle in. Not fully, not enough to forget where I was, but enough to quiet the noise in my head. And as the room grew softer around the edges, one thought remained, clear and steady. This place was not just protecting me from something outside. It was holding me inside something I had not yet begun to understand. I did not remember falling asleep. Only the moment where the silence stopped feeling sharp and started feeling distant, like my thoughts had drifted just far enough away to let darkness take over. But it did not last. Something pulled me back. Not a sound. Not exactly. More like a shift in the air, subtle but enough. My eyes opened slowly. The room still dim. The same controlled quiet surrounding me. But something felt different. I sat up slightly, my senses sharpening as I listened. There it was again. Faint, distant footsteps somewhere beyond the door. Not hurried, not chaotic, just present. I checked the window. The sky outside barely beginning to lighten. Early morning. Too early for anything to feel normal. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the floor, grounding myself again as I stood. The room unchanged. Everything exactly where it had been, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better now. Stillness here did not mean nothing was happening. It meant something was being controlled. I moved toward the door slowly, hesitating just before reaching for the handle. Part of me expecting it to be locked, to confirm what I had already started to believe, but when I pressed down, it opened without resistance. That caught me off guard more than if it had been locked. I stepped into the hallway, the air cooler, quieter, the same long stretch of identical doors on either side. But now there was movement at the far end, the same woman from before, walking calmly, carrying something in her hands. She noticed me immediately. Of course she did. Nothing seemed to go unnoticed here. She approached without changing her pace, her expression composed as always. "You are awake early," she said softly, and I nodded once, still adjusting to the fact that I was not alone anymore. I could not sleep, I admitted, my voice quieter in the open space. She inclined her head slightly, as if that answer made sense. "That is expected," she replied. and something about that phrasing settled oddly in my mind. Expected, like my reaction had already been accounted for. "What time is it?" I asked, glancing toward the windows at the end of the hall, the faint light barely filtering through. 5:42 in the morning. She answered without hesitation. "Precise, exact." I nodded again, absorbing that. "Does he always wake this early?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and for the first time, there was a small pause in her response. Not hesitation, just consideration. "He does not sleep much," she said, echoing what he had told me the night before. And that made something shift inside me. Not understanding, not yet, but curiosity. I glanced past her, toward the direction she had come from. "Is he here?" I asked, and she followed my gaze briefly before returning her attention to me. "He is always here," she said, and the way she said it made the house feel different again. Less like a structure and more like an extension of him. I exhaled slowly, my thoughts catching on that idea, before asking the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since I woke up. "Am I allowed to leave this room?" I asked, choosing my words carefully. And this time, she did not answer immediately, her eyes meeting mine with the same calm awareness. "You are allowed to move within the house," she said finally. "But you will not leave the property." The statement was not threatening, not harsh, just clear, like a boundary that had already been set. I held her gaze for a second longer, letting that sink in, then gave a small nod. Because arguing would not change it. Not now. Not yet. She gestured slightly. "Down the hallway. Breakfast will be ready shortly," she added, her tone polite, but again, not optional. I hesitated for a brief moment, then stepped forward, following her direction, because whether I understood this place or not, one thing was becoming clear. I was not just inside it. I was being positioned within it, piece by piece, and I had the feeling that every step I took now mattered more than I could see. The dining room was larger than I expected, but it did not feel empty. It felt arranged, like every chair, every plate, every line of the table had been placed with intention, and I slowed as I stepped inside, my eyes taking in the details without meaning to, the polished surface of the table reflecting the soft morning light, the quiet presence of staff moving in the background without drawing attention to themselves. Everything here worked without noise, without disruption, and it made me more aware of myself than I wanted to be. "Please," the woman said, gesturing toward a seat near the center, not at the head, not at the far end, just placed, and that detail did not escape me. I walked toward it slowly, my steps measured, and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the table as I glanced around. No one else was there yet, but the room did not feel empty. It felt waiting. A glass of water was placed in front of me without a word, followed by a plate. Simple, clean, nothing excessive. I stared at it for a second before picking up the fork, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to do something normal, something that reminded me I was still myself. The first bite felt strange, like eating in a place where I did not belong should not feel so ordinary. And yet it did. The taste grounding me more than I expected. I had just taken another bite when I felt it. That shift again, subtle but unmistakable. The room adjusting, the air tightening just slightly. I did not need to look up to know he had entered, but I did anyway, my gaze lifting slowly, and there he was, moving across the room with the same controlled presence, the same quiet authority that made everything else seem secondary. He did not rush, did not acknowledge anyone else directly. But they moved around him without hesitation, like they already knew his path before he took it. He stopped across from me, not sitting immediately, his eyes meeting mine in that steady, unshaken way that made it impossible to look away for too long. "You are awake early," he said, echoing the woman's words from before, but somehow it sounded different coming from him, less observational, more like confirmation. I set my fork down carefully, my movements deliberate. "I could say the same," I replied, and there was a brief pause, something almost like acknowledgement flickering between us, before he sat down across from me, not at the head, but directly opposite, and again, I noticed that placement, not distant, not dominant, but intentional. "Did you sleep?" he asked, and the question caught me off guard, not because of what it was, but because of how it sounded, neutral, not probing, not demanding, just there. "A little," I admitted, my voice steady. Enough to know this is not a dream. He nodded once, as if that answer fit into something he already expected. A cup of coffee was placed near his hand, and he picked it up without looking, his attention still on me. Good, he said. Simply, and I frowned slightly. Good? I repeated, because that felt like the wrong word for everything that had happened. He took a small sip before answering. It means you are adjusting, he said, and that word settled heavily. Adjusting. Like this was something that required adaptation, not escape. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms without thinking. That is one way to describe it, I said, and for a second, there was silence, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like both of us were measuring what came next. I broke it. First, because I needed answers more than I needed comfort. You said someone was looking for me. I began, my eyes locking onto his. I need to know why. The room seemed to still slightly at that, not visibly, but enough for me to feel it. And he did not look away, did not hesitate, but he did not answer immediately either. Instead, he set the cup down slowly, his fingers resting against the edge for a brief moment, like he was deciding something. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate than before. Because, he said, you are not as unknown as you believe. My chest tightened at that, confusion rising quickly behind it. That does not make any sense, I said, and he held my gaze, unshaken. It will, he replied, echoing his words from the night before. But first, he added, and this time there was something different in his tone, something that carried weight beyond explanation. You need to understand what you are standing in. I stilled slightly at that, my mind catching on the phrasing, not where, but what. And before I could ask what he meant, he continued, his voice steady, final. This is not just a house, he said. It is a line. And something about the way he said it made my pulse pick up again, not from fear alone, but from the quiet realization that whatever answers I was about to get, they were going to change everything I thought I knew. The word line did not leave the room when he said it. It stayed, settling between us like something solid, something I could not see but could feel pressing in from all sides, and I realized I had stopped moving completely, my hand still resting near the edge of the table, my breath slower now, more controlled, because whatever he was about to say mattered more than anything else so far. A line between what? I asked quietly, my voice steady but lower than before, and he did not look away, not even for a second. Between what you thought your life was, he said, and what it actually is. My chest tightened at that, confusion rising immediately, sharp and insistent. You keep talking like you know something about me that I do not, I said, and this time there was an edge to it. Not anger, not yet, but something closer to it, something that demanded clarity. He nodded once, as if that reaction was expected. I do, he replied simply, and the certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss. I leaned forward slightly, my focus narrowing entirely on him. Then stop speaking in pieces, I said, my words more direct now. Tell me what that means. There was a brief silence, not empty, but deliberate, like he was choosing exactly how much to give, and that realization made something shift inside me. Because this was not just about information, this was about control, about timing, about what I was allowed to know and when, and that frustrated me more than anything else. He rested his hand lightly against the table, his posture unchanged, but his presence somehow sharper, more focused. You grew up believing your life was simple, he began, his voice even, measured. Work, survive, move forward, nothing more. I frowned slightly, because that was not entirely wrong, but it was not something only he could know. That is not exactly a secret, I replied, but he did not react, did not shift. No, he said. But the reason it felt that way is something in the way he said that made my stomach tighten, a quiet warning I could not explain. I held his gaze, waiting, because now I needed to hear it, needed something real, something concrete. You were kept out of certain things, he continued. On purpose. My breath caught slightly, just enough to disrupt the rhythm I had been holding on to. Kept out by who? I asked immediately, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Because suddenly this was not just about him anymore. This was about something behind me, something I had never questioned before, and that was more unsettling than anything he had said so far. His eyes did not leave mine, not even as the silence stretched again. People who knew what would happen if you were not, he said finally, and the answer was not enough. Not even close. That is not an answer, I said, sharper now, the frustration pushing through. That is a warning. He corrected, his voice still calm, still controlled, but there was something different in it now, something heavier, something that carried weight beyond the words themselves. I leaned back slightly, my mind racing, trying to connect something, anything, that made sense, but there was nothing, no memory, no moment that fit what he was describing, just gaps I had never thought to question. You were telling me my life was not real? I asked, and even I could hear how impossible that sounded, but he did not dismiss it, did not soften it. I am telling you it was managed, he said, and that word hit harder than anything else. Managed, like something had been arranged, controlled, directed without me ever seeing it. I shook my head slightly, not in denial, but in disbelief. That is not possible, I said quietly, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression, not doubt, not uncertainty, but something closer to recognition, like he had expected that exact reaction. It is, he said. And the moment you stepped into that alley, he added, his voice lowering just slightly, you stepped out of it. My pulse picked up again, the memory of that moment flashing back with a clarity that made my chest tighten, and suddenly it felt different, not random, not accidental, but placed, like a point I had been led to without realizing it. I looked at him, really looked this time, trying to understand not just what he was saying, but what it meant for everything else. And now, I asked, my voice quieter, more controlled, because the question felt heavier than before. He did not hesitate this time, not even slightly. Now, he said, you are where you were always supposed to be. And something in that answer settled deep, not as comfort, not as fear, but as something far more dangerous, because for the first time, I realized this was not about me being in the wrong place. It was about me finally being in the right one. The words right place did not feel like relief. They felt like gravity, pulling everything I thought I knew into something heavier, something harder to ignore, and I sat there for a moment without speaking, my mind moving through every memory I had trusted, every moment I had never questioned, and suddenly they did not feel as solid as they used to. They felt arranged, shaped in ways I had never noticed. You expect me to believe that? I asked finally, my voice quieter now, not because I was unsure, but because I was trying to understand something that refused to fit into anything familiar. He did not react to the challenge, did not defend the statement. He simply watched me, steady, patient, like he had already accepted how long it would take for this to settle in. I expect you to recognize it, he said. And that distinction mattered more than I wanted it to. Recognize, not believe, like the truth was already there, waiting for me to see it. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly in the chair, my arms crossing again without thinking, a habit I could not seem to break here. Then give me something real, I said, my gaze fixed on him. Something I can actually see, not just words. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, but calculation, like he was deciding exactly how much to reveal. And then he reached into his jacket slowly, not abrupt, not threatening, just deliberate, controlled. He placed a small object on the table between us, sliding it forward just enough for me to see it clearly. It was a photograph, worn at the edges, not new, not something pulled from a digital screen, something physical, something that had been kept. I stared at it for a second before reaching forward, my fingers brushing lightly against the surface before lifting it. And the moment I looked at it, everything inside me stilled. It was me, younger, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing beside a woman I barely remembered, her face soft but distant in my memory, my mother. But that was not what made my breath catch. It was what stood behind us, a building, large, unfamiliar, not the small apartment I had grown up in, not anything I recognized. And more than that, there were people in the background, blurred, but present, dressed differently, standing in a way that felt structured, intentional, not random. My fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the photo. Where did you get this? I asked, my voice lower now, sharper, because this was not something anyone should have. This was not something I had even seen in years. He did not look at the photograph. His eyes stayed on me, watching my reaction, measuring it. From a place you have not been allowed to remember clearly, he said. And that answer made my chest tighten again, not with confusion this time, but with something deeper, something closer to recognition. I looked back down at the image, my mind searching for something, anything that matched it, but the memory refused to form completely. It stayed just out of reach, like a word I could almost say, but not quite. I do not remember this, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once, as if that confirmed something rather than challenged it. You were not meant to, he replied, and the certainty in that answer made it impossible to ignore. I lifted my gaze back to him slowly, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting pieces I had never thought to connect before. You were saying this was taken from me? I asked, and he held my gaze, unshaken. I am saying it was hidden, he corrected, and that distinction settled differently. Not loss, but concealment, like something had been placed just out of reach rather than erased completely. I looked down at the photograph again, my fingers tracing lightly over the image of my younger self, trying to feel something familiar, something that confirmed it belonged to me, and deep down, beneath the confusion, beneath the resistance, there was something, faint but real, something that recognized the truth before I could fully accept it. I set the photograph back down slowly, my hand lingering for just a second before pulling away. Why show me this now? I asked, my voice quieter than before, because the question felt heavier, more important than anything else I had asked so far. He did not hesitate this time, not even slightly. Because now you are no longer protected by not knowing, he said, and the weight of that answer settled immediately, not as comfort, not as explanation, but as a shift, a line that had already been crossed. I leaned back again, my mind still moving, still trying to catch up, but one thing was clear now in a way it had not been before. This was not just about where I was, it was about what had been kept from me, and as I sat there in a place that felt less like a house and more like a boundary, I realized something that made everything else feel smaller, less important. I had not just stepped into his world, I had stepped into something that had been waiting for me long before I ever knew it existed. The photograph did not leave my mind even after I let go of it. It stayed there, imprinted behind my eyes like something that refused to fade, and I could feel the shift it had created, not just in what I knew, but in how I was starting to see everything else, the room, the house, him. None of it felt separate anymore. It felt connected, like pieces of something that had been moving long before I ever noticed. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his eyes again, and this time, I did not look away. Not because I was not afraid, but because I needed to understand what came next. If I was meant to be kept away from this, I said quietly, then why bring me into it now? The question settled between us, heavier than anything before it, because it was not just about the past anymore. It was about what came next, and for a moment, he did not answer, not immediately, his gaze steady, calculating, like he was deciding how much to reveal, and that silence felt different this time, not controlled, but weighted, like the answer mattered more than anything else he had said so far. Because the people who kept you away no longer can, he said finally, his voice lower, more deliberate, and something about that answer made my chest tighten, not just with fear, but with the quiet realization that whatever protection had existed before, it was gone, completely. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the rush of thoughts building in my mind. So this is it? I asked, my voice quieter now, more controlled. This is where I end up because something changed? He did not react to the edge in my tone, did not push back against it. He simply watched me, the same way he had since the beginning, like he was waiting for me to reach something on my own. No, he said, and the single word cut through everything else. This is where you begin to see it. I frowned slightly, confusion rising again, but it felt different now, less chaotic, more focused, like it was moving towards something instead of away from it. See what? I asked, and this time, he did not pause, did not calculate. He answered immediately. What they were trying to keep you from. The words landed heavily, but not as a shock. Not anymore. They felt like confirmation, like something I had already started to understand without fully realizing it. I leaned back slightly, my mind replaying everything he had said, everything I had seen, the alley, the house, the photograph, the way none of it felt random anymore. And you? I asked after a moment, my voice steady. Where do you fit into all of this? The question hung there, quieter but no less important, because this was not just about me. It never had been. He held my gaze, unshaken, and for the first time, there was something different in his expression, not emotion, not vulnerability, but something closer to clarity, like this was the one thing he would not avoid. I am the reason you were not found first, he said, and the simplicity of it made it land harder. Because it did not sound like a claim. It sounded like a fact. I studied him for a second, really studied him, trying to understand what that meant beyond the words, and now. I asked quietly, because that was the part that mattered most, the part that determined everything else. He did not hesitate, not even slightly. Now, he said, his voice steady, certain. You stay where I can see you. The words should have felt like control, like something to resist, but they did. Not entirely, because beneath them, there was something else, something I had not expected to find here, something that had been there since the beginning, quiet, consistent, unspoken. I looked down at the photograph one last time before pushing it gently back toward him, not rejecting it, not accepting it fully either, just acknowledging it. And when I looked back up, something inside me had shifted, not completely, not enough to erase the uncertainty or the questions, but enough to change how I was standing in this moment. You said this is a line, I said, my voice steady now, more certain than before. Then I guess I already crossed it. He held my gaze, the faintest nod following, not agreement, not correction, just recognition. And for a second, everything else faded, the room, the silence, the distance between where I had been and where I was now. Because one thing had become clear in a way nothing else had. I had not been brought here to be hidden. I had been brought here to be seen, and whether I understood it or not, whether I was ready or not, that was not going to change.